for his introduction, and my thanks to Tsivi, Sharrett, and to all the team of the Silbros, Cebollas y Yunteros for this invitation to play a small part, if you like, in what is in fact a wonderful tribute to the memory of one of, I think, one of the greatest and one of the most magnificent poets in the Spanish language, Miguel Hernández. So it is in fact an honor to be here and to be able to help and participate in this event today. And I know that our artists are absolutely fantastic, as I've heard them perform before, I've seen their performances before, and I know that you will enjoy the evening. It's an unusual and sort of strange fact that Miguel Hernández is perhaps less known outside of Spain than many other poets of the Spanish language, such as Federico García Lorca, Pablo Neruda, César Vallejo, Vicente Alexandre. And perhaps this is somewhat related to the fact that he came from very humble origins. He was born in 1910 in Orihuela, in the region of Alicante, as the son of a goat herd. The family lived in a very humble way. And we know that Miguel, in fact, did not go to school until he was about 9, because from the age of 4 or 5, he was helping the family tend the goats. And he had a brief spell at school between the ages of 9 and 14, just 5 years. But those 5 years were, in fact, enough to introduce him to the wonders of literature. And we know that he began reading, then he discovered literature, initially the literature of Spain. Unfortunately, at the age of 14, his parents were experiencing some severe financial problems, and they needed to take him out and have him help out as a goat herd. And what happened at the time, fortunately for Miguel, was the fact that the local parish priest had a personal library that was quite sizable. And it was in this library that Miguel discovered first the classical poets, Latin and Greek, and then the wonderfully rich poetry of the Spanish Golden Age. And in fact, he used to joke later on, saying that he had in fact, the most classical education of all, when as a goat herd he was reading poetry in the open. We also know that at school he had made friends with a boy from a slightly wealthy family, Ramon Sige, who was to remain a friend for a long time until Sige himself died. And Ramon Sige was someone who had later went on to university and was able to encourage and guide and support Miguel Hernández in his early writings. What we also know is, in a way, the spirit. I think in Miguel Hernández we see, in a way, the fruits of determination and belief in his project. Because despite the many disadvantages, social and economic disadvantages that he had as a child and an adolescent living in the countryside of Spain in those years, we know that he was writing poetry from the age of 14 or 15 onwards. And he began his first publications by the time he was in his late teens, 17, 18, 19. And at the age of 20, he had his first important publication. Miguel Hernández turned 20 years old in 1930, and the decade of the 30s, if you like, was a decade of transformation, of rapid and brusque transformation in Spain. In a Spain that had been debating its future, its political and ideological future, since 1898, since the loss of the last Latin American colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico. And we know that major debates were going on, major upheavals were going on politically in the country at the time. And it was, despite the instabilities, it was an enormously rich time for thought, for debate, for literary production, for culture. The generation of 1898 of thinkers and writers and essayists were converging on Madrid, and Miguel Hernández initially felt very strongly the desire to go to Madrid and to be part of this scene. So at the age of 20, with very little on his side, both financially and in terms of connections, he went to Madrid and tried to enter the literary scene there. He had several problems, largely financial problems. He was unable to find a job, and he was unable to place his poems in the right magazines. And so he at that point, he had to return to Orihuela, to his hometown, and following that, he stayed in Orihuela for a while and worked on what would be his first major publication, his first volume of poetry. Subsequently, he returned to Madrid, and the second time round, he was much more fortunate. Madrid at that time, as I said, was a very exciting place to be in. Federico García Lorca was there. Pablo Neruda was there as the Chilean consul who was in Madrid at the time. And Neruda took a liking to Hernández and became his mentor, as did Vicente Alexandre. Both of them helped him to place his poems in the right venues, in the right journals, and he also found a job, interestingly, as a clerk, a clerical job, recording details of bullfights and bullfighters. During visits to his hometown, he had fallen in love with a young woman by the name of Josefina Manresa, and they maintained, while he was in Madrid, a long correspondence which was later to lead to their marriage. And of course, we know that Spain was going through huge changes between 1931 and 1936. It was the time of the Second Republic in Spain. There were enormous changes both ideologically and politically in the country, and we see that very quickly Miguel Hernández became part of the scene. He became known as a poet. He was recognized as someone who was becoming increasingly aware of his own politics in a way that he had not been when he had been back in his village. 1936, of course, was a key year. It was the year when there were the second lot of elections were held, and we know that the Republicans won again, but with a very much smaller majority this time. And we know that very soon after those elections, General Francisco Franco launched a series of attacks that began in Ceuta and then spread within 4 days around the country, and the Spanish Civil War started. During this time, during the Civil War, Miguel Hernández was very involved, but not as a soldier. He was involved as a poet. He believed in the political power of poetry and in the need for poetry in order to keep the spirit alive, to keep the spirit of struggle alive. And so what he did during those years was very much to deliver speeches and do readings of poetry around the country in the front line. So he was very much there in the battlefields, but he was not himself a fighter. 1937 was a year when he got married, and we know that he wasn't there for the birth of his first child, who unfortunately only lived for 10 months. And during that time, his wife began expecting their second son, Manuel Hernández, who would be born after Miguel Hernández was taken prisoner. This happened in 1939, when, as the Civil War was coming to an end and the nationalist victory was becoming more and more likely, Miguel Hernández tried to flee to the Portuguese border to seek asylum in Lisbon in the Chilean embassy. Unfortunately, at the border, he was detained, he was returned, he was arrested, and he was returned to a prison outside Madrid. He was there for several months, during which time his child was born. And we know that quite surprisingly, in September or so of 1939, he was, without any explanation, set free. And at that point, desperate to see his child and to see his wife again, he went back to his hometown, to Orihuela, where he was arrested again. And then what happened was that for the rest of his life, which was not for much longer, he was sent from one prison to another, and he was finally transferred to the prison of Alicante, where he became very ill with a combination of pneumonia and tuberculosis. And we know that he died. We know that while he was in prison, he actually was incredibly productive poetically. He had an enormous amount of poetry was written whilst in prison. Of course, he was denied, the comforts of writing, if you like. He wrote on whatever he could. He wrote on toilet paper, on newspaper, on backs of envelopes. He wrote poems inside letters that he posted to his wife. the prison guards recognized and knew his worth as a poet, and so many of his poems were actually kept, and this is how they have survived and subsequently been put into volumes of poetry. When he finally died, he wrote on the walls of his prison hospital, the prison hospital where he died, he wrote, "Adiós, hermanos, camaradas, amigos, despedidme del sol y de los trigos. Goodbye, my brothers, my comrades, my friends, bid my farewell to the wheat fields and the sun." He was, for all his life, a poet who was wedded, in a way, to the soil of Spain. He understood the grain of everyday life. He was deeply committed to the cause of the people, and I think there was a deep solidarity at every level in his work, intellectually, creatively, and personally. He was also, surprisingly, and despite all the sort of adversities that he faced from the day he was born, he was an immensely hopeful poet. And I think this is where the strength of his poetry lies. He really believed that poetry could transform, and he believed that struggle was worth it in the end. And there is in that hopefulness of his poetry, if you like, something that people have latched onto, that people respond to in a very strong way. And of course, his life was cut short very early, by the age of 31. But his poetry, as I said, survived, and it survived despite 36 years of censorship. It survived despite the fact that for 36 years it could not be published in Spain. It survived in some ways through songs. Although people sometimes do not realize it, they sing songs that are poems written by Miguel Hernández. A lot of his poetry lends itself quite naturally to music. And indeed has been worked into music by Enrique Morente, by Joan Manuel Serrat in Spain, and for those abroad, many of us will be familiar with his poetry through the album Gracias a la Vida that Joan Baez brought out in 1979, which has his Las Tres Heridas as one of its songs. And tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce the performers here, who will of course offer you their own rendering of his work, which I hope you will enjoy as much as I know that I will. And they are Tsivi Sharrett, Natalie Rosario, Lina León, Demi Garcia, and Carolina Esteves.